And I will ritually congratulate myself for remembering to hit record. So far, I've not messed it yet, but give it time. So today, welcome to this episode of um, Stephen Has Questions. And today we're with Marc Singer, and we'll get into what he does in a minute. We'll begin with the ritual question, which was, what was, as a kid, what was the thing that first hooked you? And it doesn't even have to be related to where you went. Just like the first thing that held your attention and made you want to know everything about it.
When I was a kid, the first thing that captured my attention and has not let go since was comic books. I was probably somewhere around 5 years old and discovered comics, and they just got their hooks in and did not let go.
Well, that worked out well then. So, which leads us to what you do now. But can you can you pinpoint? I know I would assume you could pinpoint the whys, the elements for you personally that really hooked you.
I think it's changed over the years. When I was a kid, I was really into superheroes, and superheroes in comics were essentially synonymous, right? And even though you could find superheroes everywhere else, and I would, consume them anywhere I could, cartoons, television, whatever, but comics were clearly the primary home for them. And that is clearly not the case anymore. In either direction, if people want to get superhero stories, they're now so pervasive in our culture that there are a lot of superhero fans out there who have probably never read a comic, even a comic starring their favorite Marvel superhero. And on the other hand, I also over the years came to discover that there was a whole world of comics outside the superhero genre, and that some parts of that, excuse me, sore throat, that some parts of that were just as compelling to me as the comics that hooked my interest when I was a kid. So it's kind of expanded outwards in both directions, right? Superheroes have broken out of the comics ghetto, I guess, if you wanted to call it that. But at the same time, we've also discovered that actually there's this vast world of comics outside this one little corner of genre.
Yeah, it's been neat doing this because I was never a comics guy. So I got into let's say the 1 year where Watchmen, Dark Knight, V for Vendetta, all those were all out all at once, and people were talking about it.
Yeah.
But more specifically, actually, Electro Assassin, because of the art.
Oh yeah.
Just Sienkiewicz's style, and it went on to really influence me. And but the superhero part was never that never held much of an interest for me. And also everything being, it's like you have to wait a month or whatever. And being a kid with ADD, I wasn't good to do it. But it's been really interesting because to see the number of people that I've had on here from across all types of jobs that they do now, that was kind of their big first love.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think is wonderful is how, particularly right now, how they were about, people outside the norm. Obviously, if you think about it, of course, it makes sense. But, it's so cool how that got in there really at a young age. And when did they get woke? Well, so
when Captain America first crashed through that wall and punched Hitler.
Yes, and I had somebody on, and we were talking about the first black superhero that they had, and whenever that happened, I don't remember what it was, but it's just I had no idea about any of that. I just think I think that growing up, you just kind of saw it as, well, it's just guys in capes. So you are what is it? Your job is exactly?
So my job today is I am a professor of English at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And I teach a lot of different subjects. I get to sort of teach all around the the curriculum. So I teach classes in literature, in film, and whenever I get the chance, I teach classes in comics to both undergrads and grad students.
So how did you end up doing like was there room for that to exist already, or when you got the job you were able to kind of make it?
The latter, yeah.
Hmm.
So comics have only recently become a subject for study in the academy. And I say recently, but really I mean like over the past 30 years or
Hmm.
so. And with precursors, of course, even before that, going back a couple of decades. But in terms of there being an actual field of a body of people who were talking to each other and publishing articles and presenting talks at conferences and getting classes on the syllabus, um, that's been a fairly recent development. And I guess I should step back a little bit and say I feel like as both a comics reader and as a comics scholar, I've been incredibly lucky just in my timing.
Hmm.
Like you mentioned that sort of incredible year where Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns and Elektra Assassin all came out. And, those hit when I was 13,
Hmm.
and it was like a lightning bolt.
Hmm.
And I felt like the comics were growing up with me.
Hmm.
I'm sure that's probably like every fan thinks that, about whatever comes out when they're 13, right?
Well, you know what though,
Uh,
I that's an interesting question, and I think you would know this. I think that there's a those are kind of like I said, I wasn't that aware of it, but other than like V for Vendetta, which I guess was a little bit earlier, was there anything that was presented in this like finished package that was more geared towards adults, or at least more mature teens and things like that?
Yeah, so there were a few early experiments at graphic novels. You can find them going back into the 1950s, um, or even if you wanted to look a little bit earlier, you could find some sort of ancestors. Like there was an artist named Lind Ward, who did these woodcut novels, right?
Mhm.
And then their novels, each page is a separate woodcut, but they
Oh, wow.
they tell a story. Um, Very cool, and they're from like the 1930s and 1940s. So you can find this history of artists going back a couple decades, trying to tell stories for adults, um, either in comics form or at least in the forms of pictures put in a sequence to tell a story.
And certainly
But it's
more so than just a book with illustrations, but where the
yeah,
illustrations are a fundamental part of each page.
yeah, yeah, or even in the case of Lind Ward, the illustrations are the page. There's no
Right.
words at all. So it's entirely dependent on the visuals to tell the story. So there are always these sort of precursors and forerunners. There was a comics artist named Gil Kane who tried to kind of single-handedly start off graphic novels in the late '60s or early '70s. He had these kind of action hero um, graphic novels like His Name is Savage and Black Mark. And so there's these early experiments, but it's not really until the 1980s that you get enough of a body of people who are all doing the same thing at the same time, and suddenly there's enough of them you can fit them on a bookshelf,
Mhm.
and you reach this whole new audience that hadn't been there before when comics were restricted to just the spinner rack down at the drugstore.
So I have two questions that come out of that. Hit them in either way makes sense for you. The first one is know very little about the origin of comic in getting into book form. I think they came out of papers.
Yeah.
The second one is how does that, and I know nothing about this part, how does that relate to manga as a thing? Was that in existence? Because I mean, there's a huge tradition with visual storytelling, as far as I understand, in Asian and Japanese. Was that happening at the same time, or did it, so I guess how do those two elements relate?
Yeah, so it's a fascinating case of parallel development.
I was wondering about that. Yeah.
And so there is a Japanese tradition of graphic art and storytelling that goes back to, again, actually to woodcuts and prints in at least the 19th century, if not earlier. But of course, there was a huge American influence after World War II when the U.S. was occupying Japan, and they brought a lot of their
Media.
art and culture over with them, including comics.
Hmm.
In fact, this is kind of a side note, but comics were actually one of the most popular items that were requested by U.S. GIs when they were serving overseas during World War II. I think the most popular title that got shipped to GIs was Superman comics. So they were reading lots of comics and bringing lots of comics with them. And during the period of U.S. occupation after World War II, the U.S. comics that got brought over to Japan then influenced Japanese artists like Osamu Tezuka, who became one of the most famous manga artists of all time. But he sort of took those influences, and other scholars have shown, for example, how early Tezuka was really influenced by Disney comics, which were some of the most popular comics at the time. But then Tezuka sort of takes those techniques and puts them through his own distinct spin and presents them within these Japanese publishing traditions. And then it evolves into this global powerhouse industry that we see today.
Is there a fundamental difference between a Western graphic novel and then manga? Or like, is there a definable thing other than cultural?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I don't know if you're familiar with Scott McCloud.
I know a lot of names and
Okay.
a lot of stuff, but it's very difficult for me to connect them.
Yeah, so he is a comics artist, a U.S. comics artist, and about 30, a little over 30 years ago, he put out a book called Understanding Comics, it's basically an essay, but it's in comics form. And its subject is how comics work, how they tell stories. And so, of course, it was a genius move by him to do this as a comic, because it means that he always has his own examples at hand for whatever he wants to do. And so McCloud was really interested in this question. In the early 80s, he got into manga when a lot of it was being taken over to the US and translated in the US for the first time. So he got into manga and was absorbing those storytelling techniques at the same time that he was working in the US comics industry and trying to master those storytelling techniques. And he's published a couple of books, nonfiction books about comics in comics form since then. And in those, he's really tried to break down what he sees as the main storytelling differences between manga and U.S. comics or English language comics. The first thing I should say is McCloud would be the first one to say manga are comics, right? They're just comics from a different tradition that have their own storytelling conventions. But he's a very formalistically inclined guy, and so he really breaks down the form and goes through the elements of that he sees as setting manga apart from U.S. comics, which includes, among other things, there's a serious kind of time dilation, right? Where in moments of extremely heightened action or just intense emotional impact, it might get stretched out so that each panel just shows one kind of fractional instant in time, and the whole thing becomes much bigger than it would typically be played for in a U.S. comic.
There's an
Of course, part of that just
what I have seen. There's an interesting visual language that goes along with it that you don't see as much in Western comics. Like, like I said, I know so little about it, but I have gone through those sorts of things, and that's definitely one of those foreshortened with the movement lines that you still get a little bit of that, but not.
This is another McCloud thing. He says that manga artists are really interested in subjective motion and in creating all these effects that sort of capture this subjective experience of moving or being in the place that they're depicting, where you see the hands coming out at you. So the interesting thing about McCloud's work is he spent a couple books trying to inventory the things that made manga different from English language comics. He didn't actually ever talk about what defines English language comics until I think his third book, which is Making Comics. I think that's the one where he suggested, well, maybe it's about the human figure. Like, he could come up with these generalizations about Japanese comics because he was coming to them as an outsider. And so he immediately saw, oh, these are the things that make them different. He could come to some similar generalizations about French comics. He said French comics are all about creating an environment, this sort of huge immersive.
Mobius.
Yeah. This huge immersive canvas that you can sort of absorb yourself into. But he never really tried to distill what is it that makes American comics American. Even though he spent 3 books writing about the storytelling techniques that go into them, but it's like asking a fish, well, what's the water? You're
Yeah.
steeped in the stuff.
It's neat. Bringing up the time dilation thing is really interesting to me because I'm really fascinated by kind of agreed upon language for things, particularly not non-verbal things like that. And obviously, my job is figuring out how to express an idea through some medium. And I remember when I went to see The Matrix the first time, not at all being part of the manga world. So, in that first 10-minute scene or whatever, where she jumps up and she does that thing,
Yeah.
I didn't read it. Like, I wasn't sure. I was like, so did she stop time? It took me a while, getting along. I was like, oh, okay. We're just zooming into that and slowing everything down so we can see what's going on versus like, yeah, that subjective experience that they're having versus what you, the viewer, are having.
Yeah.
So that was just kind of and then of course it reverses it and actually does slow down time. But yeah, that's kind of neat because obviously that influence is there, but I'd never really, yeah, I don't know. It was just so interesting I guess getting hit at a certain age and getting this kind of new way of saying or talking about something to you anyway.
Yeah.
So that's kind of cool. All right. So let's see where to go from here. What is it now as a reader that you still find appealing? I imagine there is so much, and I watch my friends who are into comics, and they will they'll get online, and they're like, well, this week and or this month and this comic this happens, and I'm always just amazed that they're still invested in some of these stories, and because they seem kind of cyclical.
Yeah.
So I imagine like where do you find the newness in it? Or are you reading it because you just, enjoy the characters and you like what they exist, but there's also got to be kind of an edge that you're looking for as well.
Yeah. So at this point, I've largely disconnected from the superhero comics,
Mhm.
even though those are the thing that got me into comics in the first place. And it's exactly like you said, because they're cyclical. After a certain while, you've done everything you can do with Batman.
Mhm.
And in part, that's because there are certain things DC Comics won't let you do with Batman, because if you did, they wouldn't have a viable franchise anymore.
Right.
So the field of what you can do with these characters, uh, it's fairly constrained, and you can only do so much with them over 50, 60, 80 years. Or at the very least, the artists are only allowed to do so much with them. Again, I sort of keep coming back to this moment of 1986, because for me that's like comics year zero. And one of the things that made those comics so effective was they were happening outside of continuity. In other words, they were, it wasn't part of the regular Batman comic when Frank
Right.
Miller did Dark Knight Returns. It was his own little world. He could do whatever he wanted. Batman could get old. Batman could retire. Batman could come out of retirement. Batman could die, and there was just such a sense of possibility. And I feel like after a while, you've just sort of seen all the tricks
Hmm.
with the corporate-owned comics, and so you either sort of accept, okay, I know I'm not going to see anything new, but I like this character, and I want to see what some given creator does with them. Sometimes that's enough. Or you say there's this other world of comics out there, and I want to look at those to see what's going on over there. So these days, I find the comics that most capture me now tend not to be using these corporate owned intellectual properties. They tend to be produced by artists, usually by a single person working as both writer and artist. And they own their characters, they control their work, they can do whatever they want with it. So just to give you a couple names, I'm reading a comic For a while, I've been reading a comic called Copra by Michel Fiffe, Fiffe. It is one of my absolute favorite comics out there. It's completely crazy. It actually started as a work of fan fiction that he did. He drew a comic about this 1980s DC Comics title called Suicide Squad, which is about a bunch of supervillains who are given a sort of Dirty Dozen type deal. You know, do these jobs for us and we'll parole you. And it was a pretty fun comic. It's one I liked when I was a kid. So FIFA comes up with this book called Copra, which is basically his take on that premise. It's written with all of the plotting you would expect a great late 80s superhero comic to have. But it's drawn like it's a 21st century experimental art comic. And so whenever the characters go through another dimension or something, the panel layouts get completely crazy. The bodies just get distorted until they're sort of long, almost abstract squiggles with vaguely recognizable features. But then in another issue, things come back down to earth, and he presents it in a very kind of restrained style. So it's a great comic to read because you can tell that he's always stretching himself as an artist. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, he's also always grounding himself. It's got like the artistic sensibility of, you know, an art comic, but it's still got this rock solid action comic plotting, except it doesn't have the one thing that always limits the action comics, which is Fiffe owns it. He controls everything. Mm-hmm. He can kill off a popular character if he wants to. You know, he can do these things that he would never be allowed to do if he were just doing work for hire for somebody else. So it's great to see an artist just kind of swing for the fences and push himself constantly in new directions. Another comic that I've been reading, this one for much longer, is Love and Rockets by Jaime Gilbert Hernandez. And I had a feeling you might know that one. Mm-hmm. And Jaime in particular has done something kind of incredible where he's been writing about the same cast of characters for 40 years. And they've been aging in real time the whole time. So if you read it back in the 80s or 90s, he's still telling stories about Maggie and Hopi and the rest, but they've grown up and the stories have kind of grown up with them. And again, it's something he couldn't do if he didn't own those characters and if he didn't have the creative freedom to let them age and mature and occasionally die. And he's also continually pushing himself, but in a different kind of way than FIFA is. It's more a case of perpetually refining his technique. Until now, it's gotten to the point where he's sanded it down. I'm having a hard time putting it into words. It's not that the drawing has gotten any simpler, because it hasn't, but he just draws with such an economy of the line now. You get the sense that he doesn't spend a lot of time agonizing, you know, over the inks or fiddling around with the whiteout. It just feels like he's setting the stuff down in one go because his command is so strong.
That's something that's come up a few times throughout doing these. I have been rapidly putting out a whole bunch of material lately of music, and like art, I got that down, no problem. I can knock that shit out pretty quick. But I had this really cool moment over the last, or not moment, but period of time recently where all of a sudden I was like, oh, okay, this is how all of this works. You know, getting the production, making the songs function, and removing all of the kind of like second guessing that used to go along with like, it takes me 6 months to do this one song because I'm just second guessing everything I'm doing. Well, now I don't. And so I imagine it's a very similar thing. Like, and the same thing applies for painting for me. It's just kind of like, I can just, and there it is. And I'm not saying this because I'm great. I'm saying I've been doing it for 50 years, you know? So it's, for good or for ill, I can certainly do it quickly. But having that kind of noticing it as it happens in real time with another tool has been fascinating for me. And so, yeah, I think that's definitely a great way to explain it. And I often will say, yeah, it's like sanding off those kind of like, somebody gave me a record once to critique that they had done, and I was like, I think it's good. I don't think most people notice this, but from where I sit, every time you had a decision where you could have made a difficult choice and done something interesting, you went with the easy out. And now it's kind of like I'm in this place where it's like when those situations come up, I feel confident enough that I can go with the weird decisions and feel like it's still going to work. So I imagine it's a similar, and I think that does come through. I think that sense of immediacy and as with art that you make does come through in a kind of looseness with visual work
Yeah.
or um, allowing yourself to make decisions that maybe you wouldn't have made before because you know that you can actually manage, like you won't screw it up this time. Whereas if you had tried to do it, you would have.
Yeah. Yeah. There's just a complete confidence.
Hmm. Which is just cool. I applaud any artist whenever they get to that point because it really is this very sort of freeing, like particularly when you're independent. Like I've been in this place where I'm just like, I don't give a shit. You can like it, you don't have to like it. It's cool. I like it, and that's really the important part. Here it is.
Yeah.
So, and I imagine, just being independent, that's got to be fantastic for him. So I was thinking about as you're talking about, like there are limits put on, um, for lack of a better word, corporate characters, I guess.
Mhm.
Um, it seems like there would like, and maybe it's just the innate level punk that lives in the back of my head, where somebody would come along and go, okay, well, this guy isn't Batman, right? He's definitely not Batman, but here is a story where I'm taking not Batman, who does these things that this other guy kind of does, but can't do with through their main people.
Yeah.
Is there kind of like I don't know, a bootleg conceptual concept comics or something?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, in part that's Copra is one example of that because he's taken these characters from the Suicide Squad, and in some cases he has changed almost nothing about them. Like he will literally change a letter in their
Mhm.
names, but it's just far enough off the design that he can publish them and not have to worry about getting sued. And he will take certain premises from those old '80s Suicide Squad comics, but then carry them off in totally different directions.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, there's an old tradition and a fine tradition in comics of taking those sort of superheroes with the serial numbers filed off
Mhm.
and putting them through the paces. I mean, in a sense, that's what Watchmen is.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
And so, and that gives us another kind of nice segue. I actually really enjoyed the Watchmen movie. I thought it was very cool. And I thought, I can see why Frank Miller might not have liked it, but I thought it was cool. Frank Miller, right? It's
Alan Moore. Yeah,
Alan Moore. Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry, same time period.
To be fair, Moore doesn't like any of the movies based
That
on his
that's
comics.
kind of the impression that I get. But so comics did move, then, went from like because I remember when the first Superman came out, and
Yeah.
there were a few, but they were always kind of staggered. And then there were a few like TV shows,
Mhm.
like I remember as a kid, The Amazing Spider-Man, and of course Electric Company Spider-Man. Um,
Actually, that was what got me into comics even before I was into comics was the Electric Company Spider-Man.
that's awesome. Yep. Yeah, I with the big silver eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and but it didn't really kind of hit critical mass, I guess, until the 2000s. Really, was it when right
Yeah.
around then it started to really become a thing. Um, do you feel? I don't know how has this impacted things for you or the industry itself? Or I mean,
Yeah, in a couple of different ways. I mean, for one thing, it has actually made my job easier in the sense that I have no trouble. I've never had any problem filling a comics class, right? If I could get it on the schedule, that class will fill. I don't have to worry about it.
mhm,
But I know that for the most part, it's not going to be students who read comics, right? They'll know them from the cartoons or the movies or the TV shows. It's mostly from these other media. But that's fine with me because then that means I get to introduce them to something new, and we actually take them back to the source. So like I'll show the 2008 Iron Man movie, but we'll also look at the initial Iron Man story from 1962, and we can talk about all of the ways that they've updated it. Right, they relocated it from not Vietnam to not Afghanistan,
sure.
but they also left a remarkable amount of that story in place. And we'll talk about what it means to take this kind of Cold War era story and just transplant it almost directly into the War on Terror era kind of thing. So on one level, it's been really beneficial for me in that the audience is so much larger.
Hmm.
than it was. I mean, specifically like the fan audience
Hmm.
is so much larger than it was when we were kids that it's greatly expanded the pool of people who will take my classes or read my books. So that's great. Um, but as you were describing it, I also just got reminded of how when we were younger, so much of culture and not just comics, but like everything, it was defined by scarcity, right? There just wasn't as much of it. And you had to kind of hunt around to find the stuff that you really liked. Whereas now we live in this age of surplus where everything is available constantly. There's too much of it. You can't keep up with it all. A few years ago, I was telling somebody, like, if you had told me when I was a kid that we would, put out movies about all these different superheroes and I would be sick of them. Like I probably would have burst out crying, like what do you mean I won't like the Guardians of the Galaxy?
Yeah.
it,
Yeah. I
it's crazy, but who would have thought we'd go from the point where, if you got one low budget 70s TV show about a superhero, you counted yourself lucky. And then we've got the never ending flood of stuff that's coming into our TVs now.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. I like on one hand, I really like living in the future. I don't necessarily like where we're living in the future, but I, from an independent artist standpoint, it is now easier than ever for a musician or an artist or whatever to get their stuff out there and get it on the Spotify, which is essentially the radio, and that's really cool. And you can reach people directly. And I wouldn't have a career if I couldn't do that. Um, the flip side of that being is you're right, absolutely. And this is something I've gotten into with other artists about like because I remember when I was, say, 16 or 17, and you'd have like, oh, this guy I know has the Blue Sisters of Mercy EP, and if you're
Yeah.
really nice, he'll tape it for you. And now it's kind of like, well, click, 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 click. Okay, cool. That's the entire catalog of everything they've ever done, including a bunch of stuff they'd rather not have out in the world. Um, and so like there are ways kind of around that, but you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot too. So like I've done limited run cassette releases. And it's like, I'm not putting them out digitally. This is the only way you will ever get them. Here you go. Is there I'm sure there must be a corollary with that sort of thing where people are creating kind of these boutique lines um, to both manufacture scarcity, but also I think it does, you know, create a sense of value and
Yeah.
it almost becomes a currency.
Yeah. It has that sort of that aura that Walter Benjamin talked about, right? That art had before the age of mechanical reproduction. I mean,
Mhm.
even though this stuff is all reproduced, but there's a difference between reproducing it in the form of a physical comic, right? That you have to either go to a store and buy, or you can order directly from the artist, or maybe you pick it up at a con somewhere, versus just getting it. Through an e-reader, right? Downloaded directly into your computer, and you never see it anywhere other than on some screen that you're holding.
Mhm.
So yeah, absolutely. There have been uh, I don't want to say renaissance because it's been going on the whole time, right? But there's always been this kind of determined avant-garde of comics artists who they make mini comics, they make zines. Maybe they go in the other direction and make absolutely huge tabloid-sized comics that you could never, fit on a bookshelf. But they're just playing around with every aspect of the physical form that they can, in part because that's what they love to do, right? They love the physicality of the comics, but also it does become a way of making them special again and investing them with a little bit of that aura of the creator.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that it's just a fascinating thing. And now I'm very frustrated because I actually had a thought on that and I lost it. Um, well, when the first time we met, or at least I think, yeah, the first time the only time we met, um, I brought up something that I think other people will probably find interesting too, is where do you look at, like, where are things going now in a, we have all of these systems that are kind of established, comic books, graphic novels, digital, blah, blah, blah. Uh, what, how are people then taking the art form and transcending all of that. What's the and you mentioned something at the time that I thought was very interesting, and was somebody who's making very large work and then cutting it up. Do you?
Oh yeah, yeah. Michael Nicol Yagulanis. Yeah, he's a really fascinating guy. He's Canadian, and he's Haida, which is a First Nation from the Pacific Northwest coast. And he's sort of developed this style that he calls Haida manga, which is he takes some of the storytelling techniques from manga, he takes some of the compositional and narrative techniques from Pacific Northwest First Nations art, and he'll take stories from the history of the Haida or other First Nations, and he puts them together, and he does these sort of giant canvases um, that are at the one time they're sort of like almost mural sized paintings. You have to kind of step back and apprehend them, and you can see that they've got shapes, like they'll have animal shapes done in that sort of form line style that you see in Pacific Northwest art. But then if you go in really closely, you'll see no, there's actually also a bunch of tiny little panels in them, and they tell a story in standard comic storytelling form. And he's found a way to exhibit them as both, where he'll put the murals up and in some public place, and you can look at those. But then he will take each of the individual sort of page units, like rectangular page units of multiple panels. He'll publish those as a book, and so then there's a couple ways to interact with it. You can interact with it as an art object that you can only see in its full form in the particular times and places that he exhibits them, but they've also got the kind of portability and the potential for mass audience that a book has. And the interesting thing also about the way Michael Nikolagalanis does it, he is not part of the comics industry at all. He's part of the world of fine arts. He's part of book publishing. So he's sort of even though he's using comics techniques, he's kind of done an end round around the whole industry, and has found other industries that are just as amenable to his work, and let him put it out there in the formats that he wants to have it seen in.
That's very cool. I thank you again for reminding me about that because yeah, I want to look that up. Have you ever used the Amazon has a digital e-reader? I guess it's part of Kindle or whatever for reading comics. And I recently actually read through like some Hellraiser omnibus, with that. And it's a very cool mechanic the way they do it because it slides almost animated from frame to frame to make it fit in
Yeah.
within the realm of your phone or whatever you're reading it with. Um, do you see a way that maybe comics can use technology like that? Like we're going to go into the digital realm. That opens up kind of some interesting ideas too, where you could actually play with like multiple layers of events all happening at the same time, being represented in one frame,
Yeah.
or temporal changes or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Um, Scott McCloud, who I mentioned a while ago, in the early 2000s, he was really interested in the possibilities of internet comics. And
Mhm.
so he would do things like he had one strip where he was sort of playing with the fact that uh, the scroll feature means there's technically no limit
Mhm.
to the bounds of the page, right? You could have a comic that just sort of goes on endlessly, and just you keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and never reaching the end, um, until I guess the artist reaches the limits of what they want to draw.
Mhm.
But yeah, you've also got hyperlink possibilities. So there's all sorts of interesting formal tools that people can use there. I didn't use the Amazon one, but I was using a couple other online readers for a while. For there was a year where I bought a subscription to Marvel Unlimited because Marvel had been putting a bunch of their back catalog up on this app. And you could go into the app and read it. You could do a kind of guided reading thing where it would just move you from panel to panel. I actually found I didn't like it very much. That I wanted to have that sense of the page as a whole,
Mhm.
because even though the page didn't matter as a limit for the device I was reading it on, it still mattered when the artist created it. I was reading comics from the 70s and 80s.
Right.
Those artists were working within the limits of the page,
Mhm.
and to suddenly remove that, I felt like I was actually missing. I was missing something important from seeing the art, and seeing how they didn't just design it from panel to panel, but how they designed the page as a whole.
Mhm.
So fortunately I had a tablet, so I could read them at almost regular page size,
Mhm.
and I read it that way, and it was fine. And I got to just dive into a backlog of stuff, stuff I'd missed when I was a kid, or stuff I'd read and cherished when I was a kid. Uh, but then I ran into a second problem, and about midway through the year, I realized I've been averaging probably at least one Marvel comic a day, but I wasn't remembering any of them
Mhm.
because it's just like I'd read one, oh, that's great, got to read the next, and I'd gotten like 180, 200 comics in, and I just realized it was all turning into a wash. So I had a year subscription. I read them for a year, had great fun, indulging in my Marvel nostalgia. But at the end, I said, I've got to stop doing this because I would like to actually hold on to the things that I read. I mean, not for everything, right? It's
Right.
excuse me, throat again.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
okay to have some things that are just beach reading, and
Mhm.
it's just kind of in one ear and out the other. Um, but I found that for the things I really cared about, I actually wanted to uh, be able to linger over them and have enough time to think about them that they would sort of fix in my memory. I wasn't immediately overwriting them with the next comic in the queue.
Well, it kind
And
of
I
makes
found the
sense.
same. Yeah, I
If you're
found the
only
same
getting
thing is
something
true with
like
like
once a month.
streaming TV. You have to put the brakes on it sometime, or else it all just disappears into the flow.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like if you are only getting something once a month, as a kid, definitely you're going to be rereading it anyway, so you're going to
Yeah.
hold on to it. Um, I have there's this guy named Jonathan Walk that I often he had a did a I get some sort of like thing like a TED talk on Kant's aesthetics, and it's one of my very favorite pieces of media on using comic books to explain Kant's aesthetics. I don't know if you've ever seen it or not. If you haven't, I'll send it to you because it's very, very cool. Um, but that gets me into thinking about archetypes and the how every character. It's interesting that these characters all fill very specific niches.
Mhm.
And it's almost like you've got, and I guess you do really, not almost like, but you've got Marvel and you've got DC, and they both have these archetypes represented, to balance each other out.
Yeah.
And I just find that kind of thing fascinating. I find I guess it does come back to language, but ultimately any media that we're putting out as a society, we're creating this thing to tell us about ourselves.
Mhm.
And so as we have gone through the Cold War, and then time has passed, and we thought we were making progress, and now we're not as much. Do you see how those roles have changed or have needed to change and maybe haven't?
You mean in terms of
Like with
superheroes
specific
specifically,
like
or?
the way characters may evolve between when we were in from the 60s to now. Like
Yeah.
I'm sure there must have been some progression as the.
Oh yeah. No, I think each generation of creators and readers finds ways to take what it wants to take from these characters. Like, so you see a really interesting thing at Marvel, where in the early '60s, Marvel is fully invested in sort of Cold War, uh, American liberalism, and so many of those early Marvel heroes are kind of gung ho anti-communists. Even the ones who have no particular reason to be, like, every now and then they get stuck for a story idea. So Thor is fighting communists. Like, the God of Thunder doesn't need to waste his time on this. But then by the late 60s, as public attitudes towards the Vietnam War changed, and also more importantly, or just as importantly, I should say, as a new generation of writers and artists came in and started taking over, and they brought very different political ideals with them, and suddenly they start finding ways to use these same characters to tell stories that are actually anti-war.
Mhm.
And sort of questioning some of the gung ho patriotism of just a decade earlier. And I think you see every decade do that. Again, that sort of key moment for us in the late '80s was when we discovered that superheroes could be used to tell these kind of cynical anti-establishment stories that were uh, very critical of the U.S. and its role in the Cold War. In the early 2000s, I think you saw post 9/11. I think a lot of the Marvel heroes in particular became very sort of militarized or pseudo militarized in that war on terror era. And that's as much about, I think, a way of trying to make themselves relevant again, right? To speak to an audience's new concerns. I haven't been as plugged into the superhero titles, the mainstream superhero titles, as I used to be. So it would be hard to say what they're doing now in
Mhm.
terms of the U.S. and our place in the world, or even things like class politics at home. But I'm pretty confident that whatever generation of creators is working on those titles right now, they're trying to find some way to make it speak to current events.
Mhm.
Sometimes those experiments are more successful than others.
Have any characters ever kind of outlived their usefulness, or like kind of they worked for a very specific period of time, and then it just didn't make sense to maintain them?
Oh yeah, and it's tricky when it's a really popular character that the publisher clearly wants to keep around. But I think Captain America, just by his very nature, he's always going to be so bound up in people's perceptions of the nation
Hmm.
that anytime you get these moments of public uh, cynicism or dissatisfaction
Hmm.
with the way the country is going, that's always going to pose a challenge to whoever is writing that character at the moment. And so there have been multiple times through his history when he actually stops being Captain America. And it's usually because the writers at the time couldn't figure out a way uh,
Right.
to keep writing Captain America in a way that they believed in the promise of this character who is the living embodiment of the country. So like there was a period in the 1970s when a guy named Steve Englehart was writing Captain America, and this was right at the end of the Vietnam War and immediately post-Vietnam. So of course the country was going through this moment of national crisis, and you see Englehart just trying everything. Like, he reveals there was another Captain America from the 1950s who was a McCarthyite, sort of anti-communist zealot, and the modern Captain America has to kind of fight and defeat this figure from his conservative past. But then that's not enough, and so there's a moment where Captain America discovers that the president of the United States is part of a secret criminal conspiracy. This, of course, happened right as Watergate was coming to a head. Right. And then he's so fed up, he's so disgusted, he quits and stops being Captain America and starts looking for a new identity. So that's a character who's always going through these very public moments of crisis and self-examination. Anytime his artists and writers feel like they can't believe in the premise anymore.
Have you ever seen or read? It's 3 Days of Condor was the film, 6 Days was the book.
I actually haven't.
Oh, okay. Do you know the premise of it?
Vaguely. Is that Alan Pakula? It's like 70s, early 70s, right?
Early 70s. There was a Redford film of it. Really great movie. But the premise is that Redford works for a group of people and part of the CIA or something like that. And their job is literally just to read books and then to collate, or not collate, but then cross-reference events in the books and events in the stories with things in the world to try and determine if the books are being used to tell operatives or communicate with operatives. Huh. It's a really cool book, cool story. It's funny because the beginning part of it takes place right in Capitol Hill. And so anytime I see DC stuff, it always makes me happy. But has there ever been, because there's just the volume of comics that have come out, has there ever been anything that you can look back and go, well, that was a real prescient thing for them to talk about or to bring up, that then kind of, looking back on it now not makes sense, but, seems prescient.
I would have to think about that one for a while. I mean, I guess at the time it always seems like it's really important, right? And then it's only with hindsight that we can see whether they were onto something. I would have to think. Part of why I'm struggling with that question is, I will admit, I think of comics, especially in those sort of like the mainstream superhero comics. I do tend to think of them as being more followers than leaders in terms of where a culture is going. And in part, it might just be because they have to maintain such a constant pace of production, right, to satisfy the demand for 12 issues a year, or sometimes even more than that. And they've really turned it into a kind of assembly line process. I mean, it is that old industrial model where, the penciler does his task, and then the inker gets it, and then the colorist and letter, and on and on. And so there's just kind of no time to really reach for that next idea. But then, because the volume is so high, that there's a constant need for new material, and there's not a whole lot of editorial oversight about it. And so sometimes you get people who almost slip through the cracks and put out this stuff that's just utterly wild for its time. But we look back on it now and think, oh, they were onto something, even if it's almost an accidental discovery. I don't know if this quite answers your question, but I can tell you an experience I had a couple years ago. I was teaching a class on diversity in superhero comics and sort of the genre's history of representing different issues in terms of race and gender and sexuality. And we were looking at these Black Panther comics from the 1970s by a writer named Don McGregor and an artist named Billy Graham. Billy Graham, who was one of the first Black artists to draw Black Panther. One of the things we do in this class is we keep talking about how all of these like really foundational characters, they were created by two white guys. This character also created by two white guys. But Billy Graham was one of the first Black artists to have a really big input into how that character was presented. And the writer, Don McGregor, was white. This was the 1970s, but he was really concerned about not playing into stereotypes, about having the Black Panthers stories set primarily in Africa, in his country of Wakanda, rather than having him go to New York City to fight the Punisher or whoever. He was really concerned also about gender diversity and diversity of sexuality. And McGregor is generally recognized today as being one of the first Marvel Comics writers, one of the first mainstream comics writers to depict same-sex relationships in his comics. But he had to kind of do it on the sly because it was the 70s. He couldn't come out and say these characters were gay, but he would write them in such a way that my students, a few years ago could recognize what he was doing. And that class was fascinating because so much of it was a class in disappointments. And I was trying to sort of tell my students, like, don't, we'll always be tempted to judge these things by the standards of today. And we can point to all these things about those early comics that get things wrong, but try to look at them for what they brought to the table, right? For the new things they contributed that wouldn't have been there otherwise. And the fascinating thing about those Don McGregor and Billy Graham comics was we didn't have to do any of that, because this was a guy who was writing these comics 50 years ago, and it felt like he already got it. He was sort of writing to the place where my students are today. And so it is kind of remarkable to see that. Mm-hmm. It's again, it's like lightning striking, and so when it happens, you just kind of hope they're able to capture it and get it down onto the page, because it's very much the exception and not the rule. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think of those comics; those are the first ones that come to mind as really anticipating some of the directions our culture would go in, and I don't think anybody at the time would have recognized that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really neat, and it also is cool, like, to when you think about the again, going back to language, the underlying language that you're using to communicate, that these two people are gay, or these people are a couple or whatever, that you're not used to seeing that, which is that's really cool for the art, that the artist was able to tap into that and then get it out,
Yeah.
We were just going back to the whole, like, you made a comment about characters that wouldn't normally be invested in like Thor, a certain action or whatever, and I that immediately made me think of the Joker panel that's been floating around lately, where he's all beat up. He's like, I might be a sociopath murderer, but I fucking hate Nazis, and I guess that's great. That's awesome. Another comic actually from that 86, The Killing Joke. Just such an amazing piece of work right there.
Yeah.
So let's see. You also mentioned that you teach just English in general.
Yeah.
Do you have any specific, like, I'm very into contemporary fiction, contemporary lit thing, Donna Tartt, things like that. Do you have any specific, like, authors you think are doing things that are particularly interesting?
Oh yeah. So this has actually been my big interest for the last couple of years. Is I felt like I had gotten too far away from novels. Originally I went into English to study literature. And then I just sort of discovered that there was this emerging field of comic studies. There hadn't been a lot of work done in it before I came along. So it's like, oh, here's this new field. I can actually be a part of it. I can help to build some of these institutions. I can publish work, and it'll actually get read, even by people outside academia, which is not normal. So it was really exciting, and I spent a couple decades doing that. But I started to feel like I had been kind of getting away from that first passion for literature. So I spent the last couple of years just going back and familiarizing myself with a lot of the big, widely discussed novels that came out while I was doing my comic stuff, and sort of trying to figure out who I liked and who I didn't like. So I've actually been kind of neck deep in some of this stuff. So just a few of the people I've been reading recently who have really blown me away. There's a British novelist named Francis Spufford. And it was his books that actually set me off on this thing. I read a book he wrote called Red Plenty, which is one of the most remarkable books I've ever read. It's a work of it's essentially a history of the Soviet Union in the Khrushchev era in the 1960s, but it's a history that's told like a novel.
Mm-hmm.
And it's told like a big novel with a huge sprawling cast that it spans a decade and covers all these different aspects of Soviet society. And yet it's also like an academic book with its footnotes in the back where Spufford carefully goes through and says, okay, I made this part up. This part probably should have been said a little later, but I wanted to put it here for story reasons. So it's like a hybrid of a history and a novel. And I read this. I thought it was the best book I've ever read. Mm-hmm. I still think it might be the best book I've ever read. And I thought, I've got to find more like that. And so I looked and looked. I did not find anything exactly like that. But in the course of looking, I found all these other cool books as well. Since writing that, Spufford, before writing that book, he'd been a nonfiction writer. And since writing that book, he's written novels. So it's funny because it's like it's poised perfectly on that fulcrum between the history writer and the novelist. But he's put out some very good ones since then. I've gotten into Jennifer Egan. You would really, I think you'd like. She wrote a book called A Visit from the Goon Squad, which is about a lot of different things, but a lot of it revolves around the music industry. And specifically around characters who are sort of aging within the music industry and feeling the pressure of time. And that's a great book. And she put out there's a sequel to it that came out just a couple of years ago called The Candy House, which actually takes it forward into the future. And it's all about the impact of technology, especially social media technology, on culture, but also just on our daily lives. Richard Powers is another writer who I found really interesting. He writes a lot about science and scientists. Maybe his best known book right now is a book called The Overstory, which is it's about trees and characters who have these different relationships with trees within the context of this changing climate.
Yeah, I listened to that a number when it was the buzz. So whenever it came out, like probably 6 years ago or something.
Yeah. I've been getting really into that. I've been drawn to authors who are trying to write about like science and technology, and sort of trying to find a place for literature and find a place for the humanities in a world that is increasingly being driven by technology, and to the point that now, I mean, it threatens to make virtually any creative art obsolete, or at least that's the threat. That's one possible threat. With things like generative AI on the horizon. So I've been looking at writers who have been trying to kind of figure out a place for human expression in the midst of all this.
I think that just from my point of view, with the AI thing, like I think it's a fantastic tool. I think like any tool, you can use it wrong and use it for people down at my level of things. It's great because it helps me. Like if I have a client who wants a commission, they'll give me their ideas. I'm like, okay, here's 20 different variations that I didn't have to draw up, and now we can use these as a starting point. So, but I certainly do feel for the people who are tied into that corporate world and are going to lose jobs because of that. Yeah. One of the things I think will be a very good fuck around and find out lesson, though, is I think you're going to get a lot of people who are like, oh, let's say you run some whatever your business, selling your one-sided pick widgets or whatever, and you fire all of your media staff, and so you just use AI to make advertisements. Well, the thing is, the media staff understood communication, and you don't. So they're going to know the difference between why a logo works and which ones do and which ones don't. And I think that's going to hurt people a lot. Good. Hey, you got rid of the people who knew what to do.
Yeah. I find that's the case with even with my students as well, because of course, there's all sorts of AI paper mills out there, right? Large language models that will happily respond to a prompt to write a paper. And my students, I won't say all of them, some of them seem to be even more upset about AI than I am, because I think they view this with understandable caution as, what jobs will be waiting for me when I graduate. So some of them are very keenly aware of the misuses, but some of the students, in the moment of desperation, they'll get an AI to write a paper for them, and they can't tell the difference, or they see that it's everything is formatted grammatically, it seems to flow, it seems to make sense,
Mhm.
but they just don't see the element that's missing.
Mhm.
And things that are missing even from their own writing that don't show through in these prompts. And so, yeah, it's one of the new parts of my job that I have to do now is find ways to show them, this is the part of your voice that's important that a machine cannot
Mhm.
reproduce yet, and here's why it's better than this paper that has all these perfectly formatted sentences that say absolutely nothing of any
And
substance.
repeat
Yeah,
the things that they're saying throughout it.
yeah.
Have you had to do anything to combat that? Like, I've got a friend who's a teacher, and she shifted over to having to have people make oral presentations instead of doing reports.
Yeah, I've done some of that. I still ask my students to write papers, even knowing that there's this huge exploit they can use,
Mhm.
just because it's a skill that they're going to need. And I don't want to abandon it completely.
Mhm.
I can't make them do only in class writing or only oral presentations, because I want them to develop that skill
Right, and you're
so
native.
that,
Absolutely.
yeah. And also so that they can see, oh, here's what I can do that this large language model can't do,
Mhm.
right? To help identify the thing that is actually important and valuable in their writing, and help them develop that.
Mhm.
So I haven't given up on the papers, but I have had to. It's a lot more time consuming now, because I have to, go through the AI report, and then if that one generates some signs, then I run it through a couple other things, because I don't want to use just one report, because it could be a false positive. So it's become a lot more time consuming, but it is it's worth doing. And one
Mhm.
thing I will say is the majority of my students, they actually want to write their own papers. They want to learn to become better writers. That's why they're English majors.
Mhm.
So they do the work themselves, and um, I tell myself that right, this isn't just about me like wanting to catch the student who tricked me. It's actually for the other students who are doing the work themselves, and they deserve to know that everybody is going to be held to the same standard.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I don't know. Have you read a book called Night Film by
No.
Marissa Pessel? It is one of the absolute best novels I've read. Like, I've got a few like favorite novels, and like Secret History by Donna Tartt is one of my absolute favorites. But um, I guess they always refer to it as dark academia now, or whatever.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
but this one is I'd be fascinated for your opinion on it, because it's just phenomenal. And the reason I like it is it's on an incredibly self-indulgent level, it is essentially artist as sociopath, but not in like a, he's running around killing people. It's the As an artist, there's always these, man, I could do this, or I could do that, or I could do this other thing if I didn't have morals. Um, and so the story is basically a detective story following the daughter of a film director uh, named Cordova kills herself, and it is trying to determine why. And Cordova has this entire compound. So the guy's basically Stanley Kubrick on crack. He has removed himself completely from the world, has his own compound where he can do all his own filming and everything on it. And there's this large part of the question is like, are these things that we're seeing in these films real? And not in a supernatural way, but like, just what is real about not just the films, but this persona that he has created. An example being at one point, there's a story that comes out where his son breaks his arm and runs onto a film set. And he goes, wait, do that again. And he has this kid do it like 20 or 30 times with his
Oh,
broken arm, and then, then is able to go to the hospital. So it's that sort of thing. And he goes through and he's interviewing people who acted on the film sets and trying to just figure out what is real and what isn't. And I really can't recommend it enough. It's because they're my wife is an amazing person, and she's also one of the most moral, good people that I know, and that has definitely been enlightening for me because I think that I my entire life has always been what I do is who I am, and it's all very Machiavellian, like, well, if I did this, I can do that, and da, 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 da. And so having her around has helped me kind of go, maybe don't, use people to get this art thing done or whatever. But yeah, it's really fascinating, and I can't recommend it enough. And I assume you've read Secret History, Donna Tartt.
I actually have not.
Oh, that's another one that
So I have a couple to add to the list.
that one. House of Leaves.
Yes. Yeah.
That seems like it'd be right up your alley.
Yeah.
That book makes me so angry because I really wish I had written it, and now I can't. Not just the formatting part aside, just the it because of how it is. It feels like it's a real thing because of all of the parts and all the things, the
Mhm.
sub references, and even if they're not real, it still has this sense of touching on those things that I think are feel real.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've been fascinated lately by the whole uh, collective subconscious thing, and I think comics, obviously media that we put out, but comics I think are a prime example of that sort of the thing that we all know is real, even if it's not real, if that makes sense. Like the thing that the language that we're all speaking at the same time.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I don't know, but it's an interesting thing. All right, well, I guess do you have anything you really really love that's like really just doing it for you that you want to bring up that we can kind of go over just like because I'm always fascinated to hear that stuff.
Yeah, I think I have mentioned most of them over the course of this podcast. Yeah, I've sort of already brought up a lot of the things that I'm really into right now. A couple other ones I could mention. Rachel Kushner, really good novelist. She wrote a book called The Flamethrowers, which I read a couple years ago, which was great. She just had a new one that came out this year or within the past year called Creation Lake, uh, which is both a sort of spy story, but it's also a kind of rumination about life in this era when we're transforming the planet in ways we can't seem to put the brakes on. So yeah, I think that's the other thing I've been into lately that I haven't mentioned thus far in in this show. Um, but then again, I'm also watching the Daredevil series on on Disney Plus, and getting back into that. I will always, no matter what else I'm into at any given moment, I will always come back to those grim and gritty, revisionist 1980s superhero comics because that was they were not the first ones I read, but they were the first ones that convinced me, oh, this genre could be more than just sort of formulaic episodic stories, right? You could actually use these characters as unrealistic and outlandish as they are. You could use them to talk about very real concerns, and you could even use them in the course of presenting a wider vision of the world and a philosophy on how the world operates. So I will always reconnect with any of that stuff.
That's good. It's always good to have your, know what your center point is that like you can get into and get away from other things. That's your good. place to get to. I
Yeah.
yeah, I have a lot of like books that I will go back and re-listen to. Like people have comfort shows, I'll have comfort books and things like that.
Yeah.
So, excellent. Well, thank you so much for doing this, and I know you didn't feel well, so I really appreciate this. You mentioned you have books published. I don't think I knew that. Where can people find your books and everything else that you do?
And any of the shrinking number of places where you can find books these days, I guess. So I have a couple of books. My first one is about Grant Morrison, the Scottish comics writer from that era of the late 80s and early 90s. And it's a survey of Morrison's career from the late 70s up until what was at the time the present, around 2010 or thereabouts. My second book is called Breaking the Frames, and that one is a little more inside baseball. That one is I was taking a look at my own field of comic studies and looking at some of the trends within it, and also some of the problems that I saw within it. Some of the things I felt were missing from the field. But I explore that by
Comic
doing
studies specifically, or
comic studies specifically.
Okay.
Although I've come to realize since I wrote the book, like, yeah, a lot of the things I was saying about comic studies are actually kind of true of literary studies in general, and might even be true of the academy as a whole. But that's a subject for a whole other podcast. But I look at that through a series of readings of specific comics. So like we look at The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen by Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill, Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, a couple of different comics by Chris Ware, and Nat Turner by Kyle Baker, among others. And so just looking at different issues within my field through some of the different comics that people have written or not written about. And then I just finished up one. It's not in print yet. I'm still looking for a publisher, but my literature kick, I ended up writing a book about contemporary fiction that blurs the lines between realism and science fiction. So novels that are generally, for the most part, set in the real world, in the present day or the recent past, but they use the structures of science fiction because those are the best ones for representing a world that is characterized by this sort of rapid technological advancement that has outpaced society's ability to keep up. So that one, looking for a press, it's actually with a press now. It's currently called Speculative Realism. We'll see if that title holds or not.
So like Gibson's big end stuff.
Yeah, well, in fact, the first book I write about, only briefly, but the very first book I discuss, well, technically the first one is Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad, but the second one is Pattern Recognition, which was the first big end book.
Yeah,
and one of my favorites by Gibson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Have you since I interviewed him for this, and it's really one of my other favorite book is Blind Sight by Peter Watts.
I don't know that one.
It's near future, so it's like 100 years in the future. So it's a first contact story, and it has some of the most alien aliens you'll ever meet. And he's I liked it so much that I specifically booked a show in Toronto to stalk him and get him out to the show. And eventually we became friends, and we've worked together for different things. He actually wrote the prologue for my graphic novel and wrote a story for based on one of my tunes. But it's the thing that in addition to the story that hooked me is every time he would mention a technology or an idea or whatever, I had to stop and put the book down and then go and look it up. And every time I did that, it was a real thing, just extrapolated 100 years in the future. And so that was so much fun. I adore books where I am, and I guess maybe part of going back to like House of Leaves and stuff, where it is pinned down in the real world and attached to these much bigger concepts. Yeah, I can't recommend it enough. And the characters in it are all very augmented humans. Do you know the Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat? By
yeah.
You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat in space. Because at various points, due to radiation damage and things that they go through a lot of these issues. Um, it also has, and I hesitate to say it because there's going to be this whole weight that goes along with it. It has a vampire in it because we have brought vampires back, but they're fucking terrifying and they're based. There's actually, if you go to his website, he's got a good solid lecture that he did at one of the fantasy awards, I assume, breaking down because he was a biologist, so he breaking down exactly how we did it, why they work, why certain things in mythology are still apply to them. When he did the story for me about the song, I sent him the song. And I was like, "Song's called Contracting Iris, and it's either about a girl named Iris or a disease named Iris and how they interact." And I was like, "If you want to write, here's my thinking on the story, but do your thing." And I checked in with him a few weeks later, and he was like, "All right, I finally started it. I had to wait a while because I had to figure out exactly how the disease would work." And like in real life, if this was going to happen, here is why and here is how. And you can break it all down. So it's incredibly intelligent. And then there's a sequel called Echopraxia. Uh, and he is exactly very grim view of the future. But he is exactly my kind of person. Like he loves the world and hates everything that we're doing to it, you know? So yeah, it's really, really worth reading. So
Well, this is cool. I'm coming out of this with a nice reading list.
good. I do hope you read them because they're really just some of the smartest and I to the point that I wrote a record sort of based on The Secret History. I wrote a record sort of based on Blind Sight, you know, like they were that kind of influential to me. Um, and then you teach GW in DC.
Howard University.
Howard
DC.
University.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's awesome. Well, thank you again so much for doing this. And yeah, I'll let you know when this is going to go live. I'm going to let everybody know ahead of time. And if there's anything new you want me to like just pin on with text or whatever that you're doing, I can certainly add that.
Cool. Well, yeah, this was awesome. Thank you.
Oh, no, no. Thank you very much.